Greetings, fellow Earthlings. Dave Smith with the podcast and another thing with Dave. Me being the Dave. I would like to chat about what's going on in Ukraine. I've got an article here that I would like to read. So, as soon as this happened, as soon as this kind of hit the news, I had a gut feeling like, wow, are we at it again? Is the U.S. ramping up trying to provoke war again? I just had this gut instinct on this. I did a little bit of research and I found this article written by Orthodox Reflections, looking at life in the Orthodox Christian faith. An eyewitness to the U.S. coup d'etat in Ukraine tells the truth. January 26th of 2022. Let's get into it. Dear ladies and gentlemen, although I have been traveling to Russia and its former territories for over 2 decades and have been a member of the Russian Orthodox Church for over 1 decade, I have also been asked to speak today primarily on the events in the Ukraine from November 2013 to present. As the events and false narratives about them in the West were the catalyst for the recent deteriorating relations between the U.S. and Russia. In November 2013, I arrived in Kiev, Ukraine, agreeing to accept the position of president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. This was just 1 day before the fateful Vilnius summit, where the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, refused to sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement and its corollary Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. Ooh, DCFTA. That reminds me of NAFTA here in the United States, which sent all of our factory jobs and factories to Mexico and China. Now we have no manufacturing in the United States, and our country is being hollowed out from the inside by the global elite and the one percenters. So it sounds like exactly they had the same plan for Ukraine, which precipitated an unprecedented political and social and economic crisis in Ukraine. I have no doubt it was providentially arranged for me to be in Kiev running an American NGO with close ties to the U.S. Embassy during the crisis. I fully supported President Yanukovych's decision in my report, Economic Integration of Russia and Ukraine, submitted to the government of the Russian Federation and of Ukraine in 2011. I recommended Ukraine's geopolitical support of Russia, a cession to the World Trade Organization, Russia and Ukraine's joint building of a common economic space or joint establishment of a free trade agreement with the European Union and Ukraine's subsequent accession to the common economic space or joint establishment of an FTA, free trade agreement, with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. I warned against Ukraine independently entering into the EU association, agreeing with a deep, comprehensive free trade agreement, which had only about the same level of popular support in Ukraine as did joining the Customs Union and eventually Eurasian Union. I also advocated that Ukraine move to federalism and subsidiarity. I don't even know what that word means. I'm going to have to look that up. I also advocated that Ukraine move to federalism and subsidiarity, the principle that decisions should be made by the least centralized competent authority, which surprisingly is a principle of the administrative model in both the Orthodox Church and in the EU. In December 2013, U.S. Senator John McCain and Deputy Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, came to Kiev to meet with the revolution and coup d'etat plotters. The CIA U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, Pyatt, opposition politicians, and ultra-nationalists, and to stand on the maiden stage with neo-Nazis making anti-Putin threats, and to walk through the crowd passing out bread and cookies to protesters. After the rally, McCain said this of the revolutionaries: "Those brave men and women should know that they are not alone. Their friends across the world stand in solidarity with them." During this time, ultra-nationalists and opposition politicians routinely met with Ambassador Pyatt at the U.S. Embassy to coordinate their actions. Neo-Nazis also terrified the population by holding torchlight marches in support of the unfolding revolution. In late January 2014, right sector ultra-nationalist troops seized and occupied regional state administration RSA buildings throughout western and central Ukraine. President Yanukovych refused to resort to the use of force to remove the militants. Excuse me. The highlight of my time in Ukraine was making a visit to the Russian embassy in Kiev in early February, while the U.S. Embassy in Kiev was orchestrating the Euromaidan Revolution, and about 2 weeks before the coup d'etat that would put the neo-Nazi junta in control of the government. Even in the midst of the U.S. trying to create a destabilized anti-Russian state in the mother of all Russian cities, the Russian government was still interested in discussing greater cooperation among Russian, Ukrainian, and American corporations. Imagine that. We paint Putin out to be this evil guy, but up until the very end, he was trying to negotiate. Another experience I will never forget is being greeted by right sector ultra-nationalist shock troops in balaclavas, armed with baseball bats, after Saturday evening services at the Kiev Perchakshlalava on February 15th, 2014. The Kiev Perch, let me get this right, Pechurska, the Kiev Pechurska Lavra. Ooh, that is hard for me to say. The Kiev Pechurska Lavra, or the Monastery of the Kiev Caves, the center of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, the sole canonical church in the Ukraine, was starting at the time to become a target of the U.S. aligned ultranationalists. On February 20th, 2014, a EU delegation moderated negotiations between President Yanukovych and the protesters, agreeing to early elections in May 2014 instead of February 2015. On February 18th through 20th, 2014, snipers massacred about 100 people on the Maidan, which means Independence Square in English. Although the U.S. ambassador and the opposition blamed the Yanukovych administration, the evidence points to the shots coming from a hotel controlled by the ultranationalists, and the ballistics revealed that the protesters and the police were all shot with the same weapons. Also on February 20th, 2014, 8 busloads of residents of Crimea who had come to Kiev to participate in anti-Maidan demonstrations were returning home when right sector terrorists attacked the convoy, burning the buses and brutally beating and torturing and even killing some of the peaceful demonstrators. This horrific event, now memorialized, as the Korsun massacre, Korsun, Korsun massacre, was a turning point to Crimea's destiny. At the time, the same ultranationalist militias were threatening to go down to Crimea to launch attacks on ethnic Russians. Despite the signing of an agreement between Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych and the opposition, The ultra-nationalist protesters and their American sponsors rejected it and stepped up their campaign of violence. In the evening of February 21st, 2014, President Yanukovych, believing that his life was in danger, fled Kiev for Kharkov, then traveled to Crimea before taking exile in Rostov-on-Don. Russia, in subsequent interviews, both President he took exile in Rostov-on-Don, Russia. In subsequent interviews, both President Yanukovych and Russian President Vladimir Putin stated that military forces were pursuing the Ukrainian president and that therefore his ouster can be considered as nothing other than a coup d'etat. For me personally, it was a time of feeling helpless. I was hoping and praying that God would save us from the fascist who had come to power. Therefore, when Russia responded by securing Crimea on Saturday, February 22nd, 2014, I was euphoric. On March 16th, 2014, a referendum on the state of Crimea was held. Over 95% of Crimeans voted to reunite with Russia. Incredulously, U.S. President Barack Obama blamed Russia for the crisis in the Ukraine and signed executive orders applying sanctions on Russian individuals and businesses on March 6th, 2014, April 28th, 2014, and July 17th, 2014. The EU and other Western nations quickly followed suit. In my official capacity as president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine, I tried to maintain a balancing act between my core Russian Orthodox beliefs and the expectation of pro-American, anti-Russian stakeholders. The Chamber made a decision to reiterate our apolitical character and remain politically neutral during the crisis. However, as it turned out, even the mere attempt to remain apolitical was interpreted by some Ukrainian ultranationalists, partisans as pro-Russian political statement in and of itself. I routinely met with U.S. Ambassador Pyatt and his officers, expressing my support for the democratically elected President Yanukovych and my opposition to the revolution that they were orchestrating. They refused to consider my views and pressured me from arranging meetings between business executives and the legitimate government of Ukraine. I closely monitored the activities on the streets during the most violent days of the Euromaidan revolution, but decided to close the office for only about 1.5 days, when lives were lost on the streets and public transportation was not fully operating. Upon the onset of the spread of the Ukrainian crisis to the autonomous Republic of Crimea, I spoke by phone a couple of times to the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Moscow to discuss how our common members with operations in Russia, continental Ukraine, and Crimea were responding to the situation. I remembered a conversation that I had in my office in Kiev with a Western official. I told him of my opposition to the coup, of my support of Crimea returning to Russia, considering the peninsula's 200-plus year history as a Russian territory, and of my opposition to U.S. sanctions. He was indignant and told me that I would not be welcome in Washington. I went on to explain to him how sanctions had been used over 200 times since World War I with limited success, and that those most likely to be hurt by U.S. sanctions against Russia were the people of those economies economically integrated with Russia, Germany, the Baltics, and the Ukraine. He said that he didn't care, so finally I said to him, "You do realize, don't you, that U.S. sanctions aren't going to change President Putin's behavior?" He answered, "Yes, we know. We just want to cause him a lot of pain." Wow. On April 15th, 2014, the junta leader Oleksandr Turchinov launched a military campaign against the civilian population of the regions that had seized regional state administration, RSA buildings, in the cities of Lugansk and Donetsk. Okay, so that ties into what's going on now, right? Let's repeat that because that ties into what's going on right now. There's shelling going on right there, right now. And Russia just welcomed those two territories back into the Federation, right? To the Republic. So on April 15th, 2014, the junta leader, Alexander Turchinov, launched a military campaign against the civilian population of the regions that had seized regional state administration buildings in the cities of Lugansk and Donetsk, Mariupol, and other cities to express their rejection of the coup-installed regime in Kiev. There are allegations that the military campaign was ordered by the U.S. government, plausibly as an attempt to prevent the Crimean scenario. That is a peaceful, bloodless exercise of self-determination and reunification with their ancestral Russia. Shortly after the start of the Kiev regime's invasion of Donbass, which is a historical name for the region of eastern Ukraine, including Donetsk and Lugansk, a friend of mine in the region called me to complain that the U.S. government had sent English-speaking troops to participate in the regime's military campaign against them. Other sources allege that after Kiev's initial invasion of Donbass failed, when Ukrainian soldiers from Donbass refused orders to fire on civilians and abandoned their tanks, U.S. military advisors in the Ukraine advised the Ukrainian command to use only soldiers from Western Ukraine in their invasion of Donbass. Following this advice led to the bloody war of genocide against the civilian population of Donbass, being conducted to this day by the Ukrainian armed forces in cooperation with neo-Nazi militias. Moreover, it is also alleged that U.S. snipers continue to arrive in Donbass to this day, which, if true, would constitute a war crime and in violation of the agreements made for ending the armed conflict. Wow, it continues. On May 2nd, 2014, pro-government ultranationalist terrorists perpetrated the Odessa Union Trade House massacre, in which hundreds of anti-Maidan activists, by some estimates, were buried alive. The current junta president, Petro Poroshenko, and his sponsors in Washington, D.C., still refuse to bring the perpetrators to justice. Nonetheless, on May 10th and May 11th, 2014, in referenda, the residents of Lugansk, Donetsk, and Mariupol, Ukraine, voted in favor of independence from the Kiev junta. In the past, I have been described as being acceptable to both Russians and the West. Therefore, when the crisis erupted in Ukraine, it was not surprising that various stakeholders encouraged me to try to serve as a peacemaker. Accordingly, on May 30th, 2014, I wrote a letter to Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenuk, in which I conveyed my availability to serve in an advisory capacity to help de-escalate the political and geopolitical crisis facing Ukraine at the moment, to reconcile all the parties to the conflict within and outside Ukraine, and to restore diplomatic and economic relations among Ukraine and all its neighboring countries. I still have not heard back. Wow. On July 17th, 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur disappeared from radar when flying over the Ukraine. The U.S. reflexively blamed Russia, claiming that they supplied the freedom fighters in eastern Ukraine with a bulk missile launcher used to shoot down the plane, without providing any evidence. However, the Russian manufacturer of Buk missiles said that the model of missile used to down the plane was no longer in use by the Russian military. Furthermore, in September 2016, Russia provided radar images that showed the missile was fired from territory controlled by the junta. On September 5th, 2014, and on February 15th, 2015, at summits in Minsk, Belarus, the junta leaders of Ukraine and the legitimate leaders of Russia, France, and Germany agreed to packages of measures for ending the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, known as the Minsk Protocols 1.0 and 2.0. To this date, the junta leaders in Kiev have yet to fulfill their obligations thereunder. Why did the U.S. orchestrate a coup d'etat in Kiev, oppose federalism, and instead support a unitary state in the Ukraine? Because the U.S. government wanted to completely control the Ukraine, to rupture relations between the Ukraine and Russia and the military-industrial complex, to install NATO bases and offensive missiles in the Ukraine, including a takeover of the naval base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, Crimea, to take over shale gas fields and agricultural land in the Ukraine, and to foment Islamic extremism in the North Caucasus, all with the ultimate goal of overthrowing President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and that to achieve these goals, the U.S. is willing to fight for Donbass to the last Ukrainian. My warnings about the peril of Ukraine turning away from Russia and toward the EU were not heeded. And now the Ukraine's economic and trade relations with its largest investor and trading partner, Russia, have deteriorated. Subsidized gas and cheap credits have been exchanged for market rate gas and promises of IMF loans, with socially disastrous conditions. Deindustrialization has resulted in drastically lower gross economic product, corporate profits, and tax revenues to the state. Becoming a raw material appendage to the West has not replaced the lost economic output from deindustrialization, and even the mainstay economic sector of agriculture is collapsing. Wow. We did that. We did that. In short, the current government of the Ukraine has taken a nation that was once ranked 13 in the world as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1989, a nation with G20 economic potential, a nation with close to 50% of the former USSR's industry and military-industrial complex, a nation in which the USSR and Russia had invested close to $100 billion. A nation that is one of only 9 countries with a civil aviation industry and one of only 7 countries that regularly launches satellites, a nation with more than 1/4 of the world's fertile black soil, a nation with more than enough energy and mineral resources for self-sufficiency, and somehow managed to turn it into sub-Saharan Africa. Wow. Wow. So that says a lot, right? Why do we care about Ukraine? Oh, because it has 50% of the former USSR's industry and military industrial complex. Oh my God, there it is right there. Not to mention the black soil. That's amazing. What was it? 1/4 of the world's fertile black soil. What? That's amazing. I never heard of that. And now we're over there blowing it up, toxifying that soil. Awesome. In the past, I was asked to comment on a proposal for a Marshall Plan for the Ukraine, moderated after the original Marshall Plan or European Recovery Program, wherein the U.S. donated $17 billion to help rebuild Europe after the end of the Great Patriotic War, or World War II, as we call it in the U.S. In response, I remind everyone that the aid provided for under the original Marshall Plan was not given to the fascists in Europe while they were still in power, but rather to the successor governments after the fascists had fallen. Therefore, it is premature to discuss a Marshall Plan for the Ukraine while a fascist junta remains in power and continues its war of genocide on the Russian-speaking population from Lugansk to Odessa. That is in all of Novorossiya, or New Russia. Its campaign of persecution of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, and its oppression and execution of peace activists and opposition politicians. Once the junta has fallen and faced a military tribunal for its war crimes, a government representing all Ukrainians has been elected. And the Ukraine has initiated the process of reconciliation and economic reintegration with Novorossiya and Russia, when the West is welcome to contribute to rebuilding lives and infrastructure in Novorossiya. I like that, Novorossiya. Although I returned to California in late 2014, that's where I am still dismayed by the disinformation about the crisis in the Ukraine that the U.S. government and media continue to propagate. Can I say that again? This is very pertinent to what's going on today. Although I returned to California in late 2014, I am still dismayed by the disinformation about the crisis in the Ukraine that the U.S. government and media continue to propagate. For example, the truth is not reported that the Kiev junta is the party that refuses to implement the Minsk protocols, including the start of a real direct dialogue with Donetsk and Lugansk, amnesty to participants in the conflict, special status for the Donetsk People's Republic, or DPR, and the Lugansk People's Republic, or LPR, and the joint elaboration of a law on local elections, withdrawal of heavy weapons from the conflict zone, and withdrawal of all foreign troops, including U.S. troops, from the country. As the DPR and the LPR, they have both fulfilled their obligation under the Minsk protocols. To date, the U.S. orchestrated coup d'etat and civil war in the Ukraine has killed tens of thousands of innocents and injured tens of thousands more, and created millions of refugees, most of whom have fled to Russia. The Kremlin, no doubt, recognizes that the Kiev regime will not implement the Minsk protocols of its own volition and will not be pressured to do so by the U.S. or the EU, and that the Kiev regime will continue to escalate its use of heavy artillery against the civilian population of Donbas. Therefore, I expect that Russia will continue to take measures aiming at saving lives in Donbas, such as continuing to deliver humanitarian aid in addition to the 67,000 tons that they have already provided, and to take measures to facilitate the settlement of refugees, such as their recent recognition of official documents from the DPR and LPR. Wow. That was intense. That was intense. Somebody has a critique of this article. Fine, but who is the source? Quote unquote, Bernard? What is his full name? So he probably doesn't want to be killed, right? This guy named Bernard. So pretty fascinating. Pretty fascinating, you know. And it just, you know, the rhetoric of the U.S. military is just unbelievable. The lamestream media will not stop with Russia evil, Russia evil, Russia evil. You know, the United States collapsed on purpose, collapsed the Soviet Union. You know, um, the United States has a deep, dark history of overthrowing democracies and putting fascist dictators in power. Here we say we're all for freedom, but our foreign policy shows the exact opposite. So thank you, folks, for tuning in. yeah, I just felt like this was really important to talk about, and you're not seeing it on the lamestream media right now. Not seeing it on the lamestream. So, thanks for listening. Uh, Hope you're digging what I'm doing, picking up what I'm throwing down. If you are, please do follow, subscribe, share, and another thing with Dave on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, you name it. On the Stereo app as well. I do a lot of live podcasts on the Stereo app, and that's my name there as well. And another thing with Dave. We are now in 46 countries. I'm very excited to announce. Um, so, very excited and humbled to have this podcast being heard in up to 46 countries. And I imagine people are liking it, liking what I'm talking about, because you're not hearing this on any US news stations. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. You turn on CN, Russiagate, 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 Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. It's just a broken record. It's the US war machine ramping up to go to war. The US doesn't have any infrastructure anymore, right? They were talking about the trade agreements that the EU and US was trying to pressure the Ukraine into. Well, that's the equivalent of our NAFTA that Bill Clinton got us into, which tanked the US manufacturing sector. We really, other than Elon Musk, we don't really have much being made in the United States anymore, except for weapons. Our number two gross product, our second most money maker in the US, is the sale of weapons. So here we are kicking everybody in the shins and then selling weapons to everybody to foment international, you know, catastrophe and disharmony. And I, for one, am over it. Most of the people here in the United States are not pro-war. Most people, President Biden right now has the lowest approval rating, I think, of any president ever. You know, Obama's was horribly low. We don't like our leaders here. So, anyway, I digress. I'm rambling. Thank you for tuning in. This has been Dave Smith with And Another Thing with Dave.